Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review Reprisal. This is currently on Netflix. So, I went in and I started to watch this film, and like the further and further that I started to get into this, I'm like, this is just like Marauders. Like, it feels like a copy and paste of a Bruce Willis, Dave Bautista film called Marauders. And I was like, okay, so in other words, like, are we just getting to the point now where it's just, hey guys who have never heard of Marauders, we're just gonna slip this one in under the radar, and people won't know the difference, because you end up having the same person who did that movie who is also just doing this one. A lot of people could say that there is like some slightly tweaking difference, whatever. Uh, where eventually it kind of breaks down to a separation of certain things, but it's basically the same movie. It's basically we have one guy who's trying to figure out how these people are doing. It's basically just one and the same. So let's break down or tee up what this movie is. But before that, like, how did I feel about this movie? Probably in grading system or whatever the quickest way possible is to really just go into this one. Really, I would say if you've never seen Marauders, go and see that first. Go ahead and see that film. That is actually worth a watch. Where this one will kind of leave you wanting to have had a lot more action or excitement in it. Uh, because there's a long stretch of time where Frank Grillo's character Jacob is just kind of just laying around, and he's just so emotionally distraught about what had happened, and also he's going to be sent on administrative leave. So, because of what had happened to his bank, because his bank ended up getting robbed, so eventually there's just this long stretch of time where Frank needs to feel like or Jacob's character eventually needs to feel like he needs to do something. And so eventually Jacob is to team up with Bruce Willis's character James to try and figure out the strategy of this would be bank robber Gabriel. And so eventually it kind of dwindles down to trying to figure out this tactic, try to figure out where this guy is to hang his hat, and so on and so forth, to eventually try to uh, figure this whole thing out. And so I guess for somebody that eventually wants to like have a mystery to solve, maybe they might like this. I don't know. I don't think that there's a real uh, like they rush through a lot of stuff. Also, like they weirdly like they get into it and they want to break it all down, but then they also kind of rush through it to where it's like, oh yeah, we solved this problem, and oh yeah, we solved this problem, and I'm like, you know what, like, you've wasted time here. You might as well just stretch this out as much as possible. But but a lot of it is like, oh, we figured that out now. Like, oh, he must be here, like, because like he must be like bank robbing from nearby places and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that going on in this movie, and then eventually Jacob is to seemingly spot Gabriel's character going into another kind of act of sorts. And so eventually this is kind of how this escalates and creates for an interesting, I guess, tail end to this movie. But really, there's just a lot of stretching going on in this film. Definitely check out Marauders if you haven't. I didn't review that film, but I've seen it. I think I had at some point reviewed this film, so but like it's not on this channel. More than likely, I should go back and go and review Marauders and go and put that on the channel because it's actually a pretty decent film. I actually did enjoy it when I watched it. So that might be a thing I re-review. Probably something I might review in November because I'm doing like kind of mysteries and whatever, anyways. So might as well just kind of cover that in November. It would be weird kind of covering a bank robbery movie, but I think that movie is actually decent enough to check out. So without a doubt, if I don't know if Marauders is easy to find. I think it might have been on a Hulu somewhere, but if not, you can probably go into apps like TV Crush, or you can go into an app that has the logo called Fox HD Movies, but the title will say something different. But if you search it into Google Play, you should be able to go out of your way to find that app. If not, go through any number of things like Letter C Movies. You can probably, if you go through a Google search, you can find that app. Anyways, so let's go into spoilers of this one. There isn't much to really say about this movie, and so whatever I'll say in like a even close to a teeing up fashion will leave me nothing to say for spoilers, just because this movie, to me, doesn't have a lot to just blab about. So without a doubt, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we get to spoil this movie. So we have Jacob, who is to seemingly go to his job and get ready to eventually get robbed at his job. He is to be this kind of higher up at this bank, and so we weirdly have this goofy moment where Jacob is to tell his wife, I think her name is Christina, that he is like trying the best he can, and Christina is just like, well, like, how else can we be able to pay our bills? We're really struggling here, honey. And so Jacobs is like, well, maybe I'm just gonna have to dip through my 401k to try to make up for the loss of money that we're not getting right now. And so Christina is like, well, whatever we need to do. It seems that we have their daughter here who is to, I guess, be a diabetic, I'm assuming. Yeah, diabetic. She ends up getting insulin shots, and evidently she's to quite possibly have anyways, pushing on. So none of this scene really matters, in all honesty. So Jacob is to eventually go and get ready to go to work. All of a sudden, we end up seeing Bruce Willis, who is James, kind of working out. Maybe, maybe he finished his workout coincidentally when Jacob was to kind of walk out, and so Jacob is like, "Hey, wow! Like it's good that James is kind of working out. Like maybe if my father would have kept on working out, maybe we wouldn't have lost him like we did." And I'm like, "How does like what is James your father's age?" Like, wow, that's gotta like put a sting to probably Bruce Willis's character. But I guess for Bruce Willis, we have James be a character that is supposedly this retired cop, but really when it comes down to it, you really don't know with this character. Like it seems like he's retired. Maybe he like does he have his PI license or something? Because it seems like this guy is to seem all well, and like it seems like he still has connections from his cop days. It seems like he uh, must like know people that are to eventually do whatever he needs them to do, because he magically calls people and they immediately do whatever he wants. Like Bruce Willis is or James's character is to be pulling strings from beyond the badge, I guess. So, so Jacob goes into his bank, and so we of course have this bank getting robbed by this guy named Gabriel. It seems like Gabriel is to have overly planned this whole ordeal, going and putting this bizarre certain kind of locking mechanism on this door, and instead of actually just speaking to any number of these people, he has this pre-written paper that is to tell people what to do, and they follow this thing. And so they end up going to this vault and kind of cleaning it out. And so Gabriel is to go and tell these two bank workers to have these bags in their hand and to eventually make their way up front. And so eventually these bags are to just kind of like splatter with this ink. And so both Jacob and the guy he's working with kind of fall over. And so eventually the police are to rush in and are to immediately just go and try to arrest both Jacob and whatever, because it looks like they're guilty parties, but then you end up seeing the zip ties, and it's like, oh, well, I guess you guys aren't the evildoer here. And so evidently Gabriel is to swing out the back and be able to have easily escaped from this and gotten away. So Frank is to be on administrative leave. It seems like he's consistently having these nightmares, and consistently Jacob is like, well, what could I have done? Like, I wish I could have done something. Like, I wish I could have just... I wish I could have kung fu gripped Gabriel and just took him down. Like, like I feel like I could have just, I could have done something. I really just could have gotten this guy and just could have just kicked him on the other side of his face with my leg. And, like, I could have, roundhouse kicked him. Because, yeah, sure, right? Like, because everyone has that imaginative thought of just, like, man, like, I could have had some skills to pay the bills. But anyways, so we don't have to wait very long to find out who the burglar is in this story. It's to be a guy named Gabriel. And so we end up finding out that Gabriel has a sick father who had gotten numerous medals from being in the military, Purple Hearts and all kinds of jazz. And so it seems like Gabriel's father is going a little cuckoo in the hospital. And so Gabriel goes and grabs his father and is to try to calm his father down by mentioning that today is Sunday and that everything will be fine because the day is Sunday. So that jogs in this guy's memory, just like, oh yeah, Sunday, all right, like I can relax and whatever, and just so all of a sudden he just kind of eases back up. And so Gabriel is telling the orderly and the nurse and the whatever, it's like, hey, like, if anything, if my dad just starts to act up again, like, you come to me. Like, if you ever hurt him or whatever, like, you're gonna have to answer to me, and so on and so forth. So just me kind of trying to get through this silly scene, this silly scene. Because, like, Gabriel in Marauders has a sick wife in that movie, and like, eventually I'm just like, what is up with, like, this guy, Jonathan, and just having to take care of sick people. It seems like, I think in the Marauders movie, I think his wife has, like, cancer or something. I don't remember. It's a long stretch of peace for that movie. I might not remember everything. I think I remember, like, Bruce Willis kind of being the villain in that movie. Well, the unsuspected villain. because it seemed that at first like he was just a victim of circumstance, but then it eventually seemed much more than that. And the lead detective in that movie eventually was to try to figure things out. But anyways, as well as Dave Bautista. Anyways, pushing on. So Frank is having problems with sleeping, and so James goes to him and it's like, "Hey man, I'm sorry about what happened. Like, you know what? Like, uh, I know with my several years in the force, there's a lot of times where just horrible memories just start rattling around in that head. Where eventually he is to mention about there was some time where there was to be this girl in this car accident when she ended up pulling her out of this car, and like he can still think of her like every single day of his life. Whenever he's to close his eyes, he always remembers this girl, and so uh, James is to kind of tell Jacob, it's like, hey man, take this medication and like those dreams will probably just go away. So eventually Jacob is taking these pills to just try to forget things, and so eventually James is telling him like, hey man, if you take too many of those pills, like you're gonna just need a pill to eventually get back up out of bed because you're just gonna bury yourself into this bed. So Jacob just can't let this thing go. And so now eventually the like Jacob just wants to go to James and eventually start to just break down the case because Jacob is like, you know what, like because like James is trying to figure out anything that sticks out weirdly to Jacob, and maybe to like because he of course got questioned by the police, but Jacob couldn't have given him anything. But so Jacob's talking to James, and so Jacob is to immediately ask, or James is to immediately ask Jacob, why do they have J's for two characters here? It's so confusing. But I guess names don't really matter. You're just seeing like Frank Grillo and Bruce Willis, and that's all that really matters, right? So James asked Jacob about like, well, hey, like, what was the lock that was on this door? You said there was some goofy lock that was put on this door, and so immediately they go through Google to go and try to find what this lock is, and Jacob's like, yeah, there it is, right there. And so they're like, okay, so this guy had really planned this out and was really meticulous about this whole thing, and so eventually they were also to figure out like that Gabriel seemed to have like really positioned himself to be able to get out of this bank fairly quickly, and that it seemed like he had really just timed everything perfectly out, and how just kind of like he knew seemingly every bit about this bank and so on and so forth. So so eventually they go through this whole breaking down of like, well, considering that this guy had gone through and robbed these certain number of banks, there's only a certain number of locations that would be close for him to eventually have this hideout, and because it's obvious that this guy like lives nearby these bank locations, and so now James is kind of helping Jacob kind of eventually spot this guy or find this guy. So Jacob goes to these several different locations to kind of spot them out to see if Gabriel is going to possibly come out of any of these locations. Uh, because uh, like they don't know it's actually Gabriel, but like they can kind of just figure things out. So eventually Jacob is to start going to locations nearby, and it's like, no, that's not going to work because there's too many workers there. no, this isn't going to work because people are getting their paychecks here. So eventually, Jacob goes to this one other location and is to eventually just see one guy coming out of it. And so he's like, this must be the spot. So Jacob goes into the building and is to conveniently find something of mail that has Gabriel's address and his name on it. And so Jacob is to give James this name and address. And so James is to just kind of like call his police buddies to end up running this name and this address and whatever. So Jacob is to continue to follow Gabriel, and it seems that Gabriel is going on to do another heist. He's going to try and rob an armored car. So, uh, and interesting enough, we have Mary Bell, who is to be the girl on the inside of this armored car, and she evidently had seen Jacob once before, because like we obviously have the spot where Mary Bell is talking to Jacob when she goes into the bank in the early stages of this movie. So, so now we have Gabriel going uh, and grabbing the driver and shooting him, forcing Mary Bell to open the armored car, and the driver is like, dude, she's not going to do that. And this guy consistently keeps getting shot. And so Mary Bell's like, okay, I'll do it. Like, I'll give you what you want. So eventually, so Gabriel ends up going and trying to like take all this money. And so all of a sudden we have Jacob's character who ends up coming in and starts beating up Gabriel and stealing all this money from Jacob and then running off. And so uh, eventually, what ends up happening is Jacob ends up trying to help Mary Bell from being shot at by Jacob, or no, by Gabriel. I mean, Jacob had already called ahead of time to eventually get the cops alerted that Gabriel is eventually going to do this crime. And so now Gabriel is to have this firefight, basically a shootout between him and the cops. And so now Gabriel has to figure out a way to evade all the cops and get on this motorcycle and try to get the heck out of here. And so eventually he does do so, and eventually he is to go and switch into this different outfit to eventually just kind of slip away by jumping into this one truck, this one vehicle, and driving off. And the cops don't even know where this guy is anymore, and so they lose him. So Jacob is to go and hide the money and whatever, and so now Gabriel has to take a certain interest to Jacob because, like, hey man, I want my freaking money. And so Gabriel also goes and takes his little hideout and burns it to the ground because someone knows where he is now. So Gabriel wants to avoid having all of a sudden the cops show up one day at his hideout. And so now, since Mary Bell is to seemingly be talking with the federales, the FBI, and so on and so forth, uh, Gabriel kind of waits it out because Gabriel thinks that he can get some information from Mary Bell about Jacob, and so Mary Bell isn't telling anybody anything, and So eventually, Gabriel comes into Mary Bell's hospital room, kind of disguised as a doctor, goes and starts popping off some federal agents in there because they're caught off guard. And then so Gabriel's like, "You know that guy that saved you, right? Like, you're very familiar with this person. Or if anything, like, you could really just describe this person to me, but I'm sure you know his name." So Mary Bell is to eventually forcefully say that she does know Jacob. And so Gabriel is to tell Mary Bell to call Jacob. So now we have a convo going, and so Gabriel, I think, is to eventually know where Jacob lives. And so Gabriel eventually goes and is to talk to Jacob, and then he is to also go and take his kid and his wife and to hold them hostage until Jacob gives them up the money. Jacob makes it back home to eventually have James kind of come over, and so now Gabriel is like, "Hey, I want my money. Like, give me back what's mine." James was to also say that if Gabriel is to call Jacob, that he wants this conversation on speakerphone, so that way James can hear the conversation. So Jacob is to supposedly go alone. Uh, to come back to his home, and he doesn't. If anything, James comes into Jacob's home before Jacob does. And so Gabriel isn't even there. Gabriel is just kind of like watching over Jacob by these cameras. So, because Gabriel, I guess, already pre thought all this through. So, Jacob does go off and goes by himself, but James is to eventually go on and call two of his friends to watch over Jacob as Jacob sends James the location of where him and this guy are supposed to meet. So these two guys are kind of these two people that are working with James are to kind of slip him uh, like this earpiece and kind of slip him things and whatever, and so and kind of like be in his ear, kind of telling him like what they're seeing or what's going on, and so when Jacob is to talk to Gabriel and how Gabriel is to mention how it was so tempting for Jacob to just like want to just grab that money um, because Jacob wanted to finally just get ahead, and so like that's the reason, like it just greed consumed him. And so eventually Gabriel is to tell Jacob where his wife and kid are, and so now the two other guys that are working with James are going off to go and find Jacob's family, and so they're like, "Well, we can't quite confirm where he said his family was," so they're continuing to search for it to eventually find them, and all of a sudden they find them uh, as we find out that Jacob's daughter really needs her insulin, and so now they're calling an ambulance specifically for Jacob's daughter, so that way she can get some insulin, so that way she won't go into shock or whichever. So eventually there's to be a shootout between both Jacob and Gabriel, which all of a sudden calls upon the police officers to go and try to handle this because there's shooting going on. So eventually what ends up happening is like James also gets involved, and uh, so we eventually just had this whole like shooting spree kind of going on, and so all this really just ends with James finding Gabriel at this one part of the step and is to go and shoot Gabriel. Uh, right before James went after Gabriel, James was going into the ambulance with both Jacob's wife and daughter and was hoping that Jacob's daughter was going to be okay. So now that Gabriel's to be dead, they end up calling the police in, and so now we end up finding out that, or afterwards, that Jake is going to go back, or Jacob is going to go back to his job, and he's supposedly working nights. And so James is to give Jacob this kind of uh, necklace of sorts, and is to just kind of give him this little like card and stuff like that, just kind of like giving him a little thing. So we find out that Jacob is not going back to his banking job, that Jacob instead is going and being a beat cop or just like a cop that's on patrol. So it's like, oh, okay, so like Jacob took that and wanted to do that job to kind of feel more fulfilled. And so, yeah, so I guess like he would never want that kind of thing to happen again for his family. So I guess like, yeah. So that was kind of an interesting ending to where eventually Jacob was to eventually decide to be a police officer. Um, and plus, also, I guess it's nice to technically have that badge handy whenever you're to really just do any number of things. But yeah, so with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. Much shorter the review than usual, just because there was not much to say about this movie. It's a lot of putting puzzle pieces together, and hopefully I got everything. But I feel good about finishing this up. There wasn't much of dialogue or much of stuff like that I wanted to really talk about here. It's either check the movie out for simply dialogue. Um, but I think I even covered bits and pieces of that. So, with that said, I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.